Maybe more than any other province in all of the games, Skyrim is what most people think of when they hear the phrase Elder Scrolls. And that's because Skyrim is not only, as of writing this, the setting of the best-selling and most popular Elder Scrolls game of all time, but is also a place that immediately makes you just sit back and think, wow. Situated as the northernmost province in all of Tamriel, Skyrim is covered in snow-capped mountains, icy tundras, and unforgiving winters, all culminating in a place that feels harsh yet beautiful at the same time. Almost like that cozy feeling you get sitting around a campfire in the dead of winter. To the east beyond the Velothai mountain range lies Morrowind. To the south across the Geralt Mountains is Cyrodiil, and west through the Druidak Peaks are the great kingdoms of Hammerfell and High Rock. If you haven't picked up on it already, Skyrim itself is anything but flat, boasting 4 of the 5 largest mountain ranges in the entirety of Tamriel, and this means that traversing the region can be tough both from a logistical and mental standpoint. Because of this, the inhabitants of Skyrim, primarily of which are Nords, are harsh and rigid, often keeping to themselves and doing everything that is necessary for survival. The Nords also have divided Skyrim into multiple holds, each of which a Jarl presides over, helping to facilitate day-to-day functions like trade, defense, and general politics. It's an obviously Game of Thrones-inspired setting, mixed in with some really cool flora and fauna, including ice wolves, nightshades, slaughterfish, luna moss, or deathbell flower patches. And for that reason, many in the Elder Scrolls community absolutely adore everything Skyrim has to offer. It's one of the most unique biomes in all of Tamriel, and gives us a taste of what some of the continents further away from the equator might be like. And really, Skyrim just has so much going for it. Glaciers to the north, hidden Dwemer ruins to the east, or Riften, a warmer outcrop within Skyrim's borders that is home to swamplands, forests, and the illustrious Thieves Guild. And on top of this, each and every town or city is full of lots of Viking and Gothic-inspired architecture, with cities that are built into literal mountains, and granite temples or thatch roofs that really immerse you in the never-ending winter wonderland. But you see, while for many people this setting works so well, for me, I personally don't enjoy super cold places in games for any more than short bursts. I love snow levels, but not snow games. And if there ever was a poster boy for snow in Tamriel, it's Skyrim, which is why I tend to gravitate away from it despite how awesome it can be at times. Don't get me wrong, seeing an aurora borealis as you look into the night sky and the sounds of a nearby river fill the void while snow falls is a magical experience. It's just one that I only like here and there. Having said that though, my personal take on Skyrim aside, what actually makes this province so amazing, and the reason I put it above Cyrodiil, the setting of my favorite Elder Scrolls game, is the rich lore and history. During the Dawn era, Skyrim itself was much different. At the time, the mountains were being born from some unknown force, and mysterious and powerful relics like Skyforge were beginning to take root. In later eras, the elves that stumbled upon the lands of Skyrim grew afraid of the magics and powers at play here, some of which might have been at the hands of the malevolent and powerful dragon cult who worships dragons as above the gods themselves and speaks to them through priests. The powers you garner in Skyrim actually come from these ancient times, but things only get more interesting from there. During the Merethic era, the Aldmer, an evolving race of snow elves, reigned supreme all over Skyrim, constructing great fortresses in many of the mountain ranges and hunting local wildlife like woolly mammoths or giants for food. This period of relative peace, though, was brought to an abrupt end at the end of the Merethic era, when a large force of Nords from the northern continent of Atmora, led by their fearsome and charismatic leader Ysgramor, sailed across the Sea of Ghosts and invaded the province, quickly taking it under their control due to superior military power from a civilization forged under centuries of war on a continent we know so little about. Under the rule of the Nords, the Snow Elves were seen as second-class citizens, but allowed to have their own settlements dotted across the lands to do as they pleased. Or in other words, the two civilizations lived side by side in Skyrim, peaceful for the most part, but always at each other's throats. However, this too would soon come to an end. In an event known as the Night of Tears, a band of Snow Elf rebels attacked and slaughtered many Nordic civilians at the settlement of Cyrodiil, spinning the Nords into a flurry of rage as Ysgramor and his people were forced to retreat. Multiple scholars argue on the reasons for why the Snow Elves even did this, ranging from retaliation for years of bad treatment all the way to ancient artifacts the humans were close to discovering that the elves were willing to risk their lives for. But regardless, as expected, these crimes did not go unpunished, and in time, Ysgramor and the Nordic people, with blood in their veins, returned to slaughter those who killed their people. Nordic axes and arrows drew blood on anything that even looked close to a snow elf, in one of the most horrific genocides Tamriel has ever seen. So devastating, in fact, that the entire snow elf race was forced into hiding. And during these desperate times, as hard as it is to believe, things were about to get much worse for the elvish clans in Skyrim. In order to hide from the rampaging Nords, the Snow Elves made a deal with the Dwemer in Skyrim, allowing them access to their massive and protected underground cities as long as they drank a strange and mysterious potion. This potion turned out to be a horrific drug, which when consumed blinded all of the Snow Elves, after which they were turned into slaves for the Dwemer and experimented on endlessly, eventually twisting and contorting them into the monstrosities we know them as today, the Falmer. Hairless creatures that walk on all four limbs in the darkest and deepest caves or dungeons of Skyrim, killing anything in their path and feasting on the flesh. It's one of the most tragic tales in Elder Scrolls, and really shows you how dark things can get in the region of Skyrim, full of ancient mysteries and lore that we still know so little about. Luckily though, from this period that stretched into the First Era onward, most of the notable events are land grabs, hold disputes, or general events like the Oblivion Crisis, up until the time we play in Skyrim in the Fourth Era and set forth on a battle against great evil. And overall, Skyrim is a lot of people's favorite province in the Elder Scrolls for a reason. If you love cold environments, Viking architecture and folklore, or dark and twisted themes of ancient history, Skyrim has everything you could ask for and more. But like I mentioned before, while I do love Skyrim in short bursts, it's not quite the kind of setting I find most compelling in games, and in my opinion, most certainly not the most compelling region in Elder Scrolls by any account. Almost ironically, for the first province on this list, we are turning to the setting of my personal favorite Elder Scrolls game of all time, Oblivion. Set in Cyrodiil, also known as the Imperial Province, this region is at the heart of all Imperial governance and trade, quite literally at the center of the continent. And it's also the staging ground for the Imperial City itself, capital of the Tamrielic Empire and one of the most impressive cities in canon. The geography of the region is characterized by a mostly temperate climate, with many staples you would expect to see in any high fantasy setting, like minotaurs, zombies, centaurs, giant rats, annoying crabs, and a dizzying amount of wolves, deer, and bears in the woods. It means that while many other regions of Tamriel can seem almost foreign or alien to those new to the series, Cyrodiil is actually the perfect place to start if you need something that's more familiar. Almost everywhere you go will either be a woodland retreat or a massive sprawling valley. And because of that, despite the pervasiveness of dangerous cave networks beneath ruins and mountains, for most people living in Cyrodiil, the experience is fairly safe. Guard patrols stalk through the night to keep major roads protected. There are multiple major cities all within a semi-close distance to one another with high walls for defense, and at the center of it all sits the Imperial City itself, which is home to hundreds of famous shops and markets of which you can buy or sell anything your heart desires. And afterwards, you can spend some of your hard-earned coin at the nearby Colosseum, which boasts fights between gladiators and mythical creatures out for blood. On top of this, Cyrodiil is one of the most educated cultures in all of Tamriel, with many citizens being fully literate and lots of wealth to be found all around the province. This doesn't mean, however, that Cyrodiil isn't home to large amounts of inequality, as some cities like Skingrad, Leowyn, and Anvil live in relative luxury, while Bravil, in contrast, for example, is characterized by rampant homelessness and stealing. But maybe most interesting of all, Cyrodiil is also a breeding ground to lots of different cultures and religions, and with that, is a hotbed for many grand conflicts. During the First Era, the province was actually under the control of the Aelids, a race of elves who stemmed from the Somerset Altmer that long ago during the Merethic era had taken control of the heartland of Tamriel. These Aelid rulers at the time subjected the Nedic humans of the region into harsh slavery. For those of you who don't know, the Needs were an ancient race of humankind that existed on the continent even before the Nords, and situated themselves into small tribes with huge variations in how ways of life were conducted, similar to, say, our most up-to-date understandings of primitive peoples in around 2000 BC in our real lives. One Nedic woman named Elsweyr, after apparently receiving a vision from the dragon god of time Akatosh, began a revolt against the Aelid Empire, uniting many bands and tribes of different people and cultures together to all rise up against their oppressors. With the help of the newly arrived Nordic peoples and their firepower to the north, Elsweyr and the rebels were able to overthrow the Aelid elves, and in the wake of their destruction, she founded the pantheon of the Eight Divines, compromised between many Marish, Nordic, and Nedic beliefs into one sort of super religion that tried to take customs and traditions of all of them. In fact, this religious system still lives on into the modern day, albeit with one notable change we'll talk about here shortly. Nonetheless, this period marked the original founding of the Alessian Empire, which went on to quickly gain control of more and more land nearby its borders. This time of prosperity did not last forever though, as thousands of years later, near the end of the First Era, a massive invasion from the Akaviri continent made landfall in Tamriel, with the focus of its might being sent to the people of Cyrodiil. Almost by some sort of miracle, the Akaviri were defeated at the Battle of Pale Pass by a renowned commander named Remen Cyrodiil. Sound familiar? Who then took some of the defeated warriors under his wing and had them swear loyalty, after which he established a new nation-state, declared himself emperor, and transformed Cyrodiil and its culture into what we still know it as today, taking a lot of medieval European influence from the nobility in High Rock at the time to the west. By the middle of the Second Era though, Cyrodiil once again found itself in a state of chaos known as the Interregnum, which lasted for 400 years. After the assassination of many of the highest-ranking imperial officers on one bloody night known as Sun's Dawn in year 430 of the Second Era, multiple cities started to turn against the Empire. Imperial infrastructure fell into disarray and despair, and many petty warlords or tribes were vying to take control during this vacuum of power. One of these tribes, led by a man named Cuchulainn, rose above the rest, and was able to unite the Nords yet again to help in their effort. But just as they were on the verge of total domination, Cuchulainn was assassinated by his general Talos, who took control of every army instantly, and in doing so, took on a new name, Tiber Septim, after which he was swiftly crowned emperor and declared the beginning of the Third Era. On top of this as well, Tiber Septim also added himself as the ninth divine to the existing pantheon, because why not? Overall though, this era for Cyrodiil was mostly one of restoration and conquest, with many new emperors and political leaders taking power and losing it again over the years. All the way up until the Oblivion Crisis, which saw Daedra pouring through portals into the mortal world and sacking cities. With time though, this invasion too was defeated after Mehrunes Dagon, a powerful Daedric prince, was slain in his mortal form at the Imperial capital, something you actually get to play out in the Oblivion mainline game. After this, during the Fourth Era, otherwise known as when Skyrim takes place, while we don't get to actually see it ourselves, we hear many times about the Thalmor invasion and takeover of the Imperial City, which eventually was thwarted by the Imperial Legion army at the Battle of the Red Ring. So as you can see, Cyrodiil is no stranger to controversy. And because of not only its strategic geographical position, but all of the centralized wealth and power, everyone wants a piece. And speaking of power, at the center of Cyrodiil itself lies potentially one of the most important sources of power in the entire series, the White Gold Tower, also called the Imperial Palace. Almost impossible to miss, the Imperial Palace is an enormous spire that reaches into the sky at the center of the Imperial City, which is modeled after the famous Adamantine Tower, the oldest known standing structure in all of Tamriel, found in the Iliac Bay of High Rock. The White Gold Tower is rumored to have great magics or control of the Elder Scrolls themselves, and many believe that it may serve as a sort of anchor that keeps Mundus, the mortal realm, grounded and guarded against the chaos of Oblivion. Most interestingly though, during the Merethic era, There are many accounts of early Aelids and Nedic people mentioning that Cyrodiil actually used to be much different. You see, these early primarily nomadic peoples describe the province as being covered in dense jungles and rainforests, with flora and fauna that would more quickly make you think of the Black Marsh or Valenwood than anything resembling modern-day Cyrodiil. Some have speculated that the White Gold Tower may be to blame, and some ancient scholars have even spun up rumors that Tiber Septim himself might have actually used the tower to terraform the lands many years ago, making them more hospitable for the Imperial race. Also, fun fact for a lot of you watching, a lot of rumors in the actual Elder Scrolls and Bethesda communities think this is all a retcon after Todd Howard wanted their next game to resemble Lord of the Rings more than what would have otherwise been a heavily forested jungle. But as to what the real truth is, it's hard to say. Either way though, Cyrodiil has served as the centerpiece for so many important events in the history of Tamriel. And in many ways, it could be argued that it's the most important province from a political standpoint. But I will have more to say on that later in the video. The thing is though, the region is actually quite bland when compared to others. You could easily use this setting in any generic fantasy world or game and it would instantly work, with goblins and trolls alike. But part of that familiarity is also what makes it so great, as it grounds what is otherwise a very strange and fantastical setting around a capital that is immediately recognizable. You could show someone certain scenes from, say, Morrowind, and they might think you're playing a sci-fi game. But outside of stepping into the actual Oblivion gates, the gameplay in Cyrodiil from Oblivion is distinctly medieval European inspired. And it's because of that that most of my love for the Oblivion game actually stems from the writing and quests, some of the best Bethesda has ever done, and not really the setting. Because while Cyrodiil is amazing in so many ways, and key to a lot of the lore in the Elder Scrolls series, with some really core mysteries about its origins and some of the ancient structures that can be found, it leaves a lot to be desired in its actual implementation and design, which is too reminiscent of every other fantasy world you've ever played and lacks a lot of variety. In many cases, if you think something in Cyrodiil looks cool, it's even more interesting in one of the adjacent territories. Skyrim has better mountains, the Black Marsh has more scary swamps, Morrowind fascinating otherworldly influences, and Valenwood actually dense forests. But personally, I don't know, there's something about Cyrodiil that just feels like home. Not because of my nostalgia playing it as a kid, but because even playing Oblivion nowadays and discovering all that Cyrodiil has to offer is a perfect reminder of what Elder Scrolls as a series is all about. And it will always be the setting of one of the games that made me fall in love with this medium originally. But as you're about to see, other places in Tamriel can get really crazy and a lot more weird. In the world of the Elder Scrolls, it feels like certain regions and ideas or cultures get a lot more love than others, based primarily on what players have already seen or heard about. So oftentimes, some of the most exciting bits of lore or world building see little discussion or examination, meaning they fall to the wayside when truly, I think more players should be getting excited about them. And one of the best examples of this is Elsweyr. Home to the feline humanoid race known as the Khajiit, Elsweyr sits squarely in the southern portion of Tamriel, directly to the south of Cyrodiil and east of Valenwood. The province itself is split into two distinct regions. Anakinna to the north, with its harsh badlands or savannas and desolate dry plains, and Palatine to the south, composed of lush and vibrant rainforests, jungles, Southeast Asian-inspired architecture, and rivers that span for miles. The two regions, while both part of Elsweyr, oftentimes find themselves at odds, due to how different the cultures and lifestyles in each are. In Anakinna to the north, life is dictated by a tribalistic warrior culture, who must fight to survive under the trying weather conditions daily, and see their brethren to the south as pompous aristocrats who are high on their own egos. The southern territories of Palatine, in contrast, are decadent and divine, with impressive cities like Senchal that span for miles, and many affluent Khajiit families that play political games with their enemies, even their own fellow feline kind. To the south of Palatine as well is a small island called Canarthi's Roost, full of plantation farms and shrines to multiple gods, most prominently the Moon Emperor, meaning many travel to the island frequently to give thanks to their creators. This dichotomy between the north and south and Elsweyr lends to a lot of interesting political strife in the province, and this tension actually stems all the way back to the founding of the region thousands of years ago. You see, during the Merethic era, Elsweyr was actually composed of 16 distinct tribes, each which controlled varying swaths of land in the region. The early years of this power struggle saw the Khajiit rise to great prominence, with many ancient historical accounts describing most of southern Tamriel as controlled by the felines. But rather than being tyrannical overlords, the tribes presumably lived in relative harmony, with specific chiefs of tribes like Calgrantid learning to trick and tame dragons or other beasts alike, which left the province wide open for bustling trade networks, social gatherings, and transfers of culture and thought. By any measure, the Khajiit tribes of this time would have been some of the most powerful and peaceful on the continent, with the only truly notable destruction being rumors that they are what caused the extinction of the ancient Birdmen race in the City Isles that may have been similar to some modern Akaviri races, along with a warlike tribal captain here or there that sprouted up periodically in the First Era. And these customs have in part carried over to modern Tamriel as well, with many beautiful and idyllic Khajiit villages all across the varying biomes of Elsweyr, which would make breathtaking travel destinations for any adventurous travelers. The real catalyst for Elsweyr's initial change, though, actually came right at the end of the First Era in the form of a horrific contagion known as the Thracian Plague. Initially spread across prominent trade routes in the region, the Thracian Plague was a terrifying condition for many not just in Elsweyr, but all of Tamriel. Artificially developed by the slug humanoid race known as the Slode in their coral kingdoms of Thras, situated southwest of Tamriel, this plague was spread through seafaring creatures that would crawl onto the coasts of multiple cities as the disease would take hold. The actual condition itself would induce bouts of mania in its subjects, even forcing them to drink liquids endlessly until the bones in their bodies began to be crushed under the weight of never-ending gluttony. Hundreds of thousands across Tamriel died horrifically during this period, as the Slode launched invasions on multiple coastal cities full of mass graves. And while this onslaught eventually was thwarted and the Thracian Plague dealt with, it left ruin in its wake, and maybe none more than Elsweyr. Because in the province, the plague actually resulted in the dissolving of the existing 16 tribes into just 2, one to the north and one to the south, which would form the basis for the structure of modern-day Elsweyr that we've already discussed. Not long after this period of tragedy, though, even more conflict struck, as during the Second Era, the Empire launched a full invasion of Elsweyr while the two new tribes were in conflict with one another over previous tribalistic disputes, leaving room for the Emperor to found a new Elsweyr confederacy all under one banner in the region, serving the Emperor to the north in Cyrodiil. This change in political structure too did not last long though, as Khajiit rebellions began to burst out all across Elsweyr, which eventually resulted in the First Main, a spiritual leader for the Khajiit, leading his people through the teaching of the Riddle Thar, a cosmic deity or force that was used as a set of guidelines for how to live. This is the period of time that truly gave rise to the northern chiefdoms and tribalistic warriors and southern affluent antiquity that split so much of Elsweyr's culture and society all the way up until today. But the struggles didn't end here. As if it wasn't already clear, ever since the First Era, Elsweyr has been in constant conflict and strife. After the Khajiit rebellions against the Empire, Elsweyr would have to go on to deal with another contagion, the Connaughton Flu, which killed many, followed by Aldmeri invasions, the return of fearsome dragons, and wars with Tiber Septim in the Third Era as the races of man once again tried to subjugate their feline friends. Funnily enough, it was the Oblivion Crisis that finally gave Elsweyr some breathing room from adversaries, because while yes, the lands were being ravaged by Daedra, it distracted nearby provinces to defend themselves, meaning that once the crisis was dealt with, Elsweyr was left to its own devices, which, as you would expect, meant major conflicts between the north and south, with assassinations being commonplace. And overall, Elsweyr as a province is one of the most dizzying in terms of timelines and events. So much has happened in this southern dystopia, with multiple cultures, wars, and even Nirn's two moons, Masser and Secunda, disappearing for a brief period, which shook the Khajiit people and their moon worship greatly. And overall, all of these events have shaped the region into one of the most fierce, but also one of the most storied, with so much fascinating history and lore to dig into that will keep you captivated for hours. Whereas other provinces in the south like the Black Marsh almost feel like separate worlds at times, Elsweyr has always been highly integrated into Tamrielic society, with politics and cultures constantly shifting with the moving tides of conflicts going on elsewhere. It's a perfect example of what happens in a region when you just won't leave it alone for multiple centuries. And because of that, Elsweyr itself is abundant in so many things to see, which really, if we're being honest, is what the Elder Scrolls series is all about. A game set here would for sure have so many different places to explore and lots of things to do. It's potentially one of the most varied locations you could have in an Elder Scrolls mainline game of all time. But for me though, while I do love Elsweyr and all the variety and rich culture it has to offer, many of the wars, famines, and plagues have rotted away much of the ancient structures and mysteries in the region, meaning other provinces have a more defined theme or ideas which are instantly recognizable.